Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a great time so far at the conference. My name is Ronaldi, and today I'll be talking about leveraging HashiCorp and AWS for environmentally sustainable deployments, a step into the green future, where we'll be examining how we can use HashiCorp's tools like Terraform and Consul to be able to architect much more sustainable deployments and hence improve our foothold into the future. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So, a bit about myself. I currently hold all 13 certifications from AWS. I also am an SME for the AWS Solutions Architect Professional and the AWS Data Analysis Specialty certifications. I also currently hold the Terraform Associate certification. I also am an international speaker at over 3 events and conferences. So I speak on a lot of different topics, Terraform included, and also regarding AWS, generative AI, and much more. And in general, I just really enjoy all things AWS, open source, testing, and virtual reality. So we come across the problem itself, which is based on 4 key areas: sustainability, costs, customers, and innovation. Let's start off with sustainability first. Nowadays, if you're operating, especially if you're operating in a big organization, you know the challenges of demanding stakeholders and the framing of getting better green technology being used within the company. So, aligning with green technology principles becomes a must. This could be done through working with your ESG group, for example, or working with your stakeholders to be able to establish those particular principles. And that itself needs to be taken into consideration. There's also a lot of wastage that is often done on the wrong technologies. So this could be a number of different things. You could be deploying on EC2 instances, for example, that are too big, or simply just a matter of wrong template choices that you have chosen for database instances, auto-scaling, and much more. Consumers also want to feel better about the organizations that they support, because it's definitely better to support an organization that promotes green practices and is already able to accomplish green practices than an organization that is not able to do so and instead fosters this kind of wastage culture. So it's a very important thing to be able to get alignment based on that. And hence that leads to innovation, which is made possible with the innovations that are present today. We can start solving these problems with the innovations that are made today. And all it takes really is the integration of some tools alongside some conscious practices that you make in alignment with decisions that are made towards achieving the green technology goals that we have established before. Sustainability in AWS is really dependent on a number of key factors. So first of all, there's always the talk of optimization of computing resources, where you need to be very mindful of how you choose to be able to use different computing resources and appropriately making sure that there's no wastage. It's also about choosing the AWS regions with renewable energy sources, because AWS also makes it explicit in their documentation that there are some regions that are already using more renewable energy than others. So this is definitely something to take into account. Aside from that, also the consideration of using serverless architectures. As you know, the transition towards serverless, if you're already on-prem, is not always the smoothest thing, but regardless, it does help a lot with being able to move towards renewable energy sources and pretty much less consumption of resources essentially. Of course, there's also resource scaling, for example, with auto scaling policies, and appropriately putting in caps as well to ensure that you're not provisioning more than necessary. You're also able to manage e-waste accordingly that way, and hence you can also then start monitoring your carbon footprint, and AWS provides some tools about that too. So what tools will we be using in our particular talk today? And we'll be pretty much talking about 5 different tools and see how they are used within this integration, which are Terraform, Consul, GitHub, Ansible, and AWS. So if we go by a step-by-step process, there are 6 steps really that we have to go towards establishing this kind of pipeline, and also being able to integrate green practices as part of it too. First, we'll have to define our sustainable deployment goals. So we'll have to define what particular KPIs do we want to use to track how well we are doing with this new initiative. What's the limits that we want to enforce as part of our initiative? And how do we want to ensure that people actually do follow through with it? These are key questions that you will need to ask along the way while you define your own sustainable deployment goals. Because you'll need to get buy-in from the business too. You'll need to get buy-in from your board if you're in a public company. You'll need to get buy-in from necessary executives, senior executives. So these are all very important things that you need to consider as part of your deployment strategy. Aside from that, you'll also need to set up your AWS and Terraform environments afterwards. So if you don't already have it set up, you need to set it up. But if instead you're taking on it as a migration initiative, then you need to slowly migrate towards those AWS and Terraform environments. You then will start to integrate Consul for service mesh. You'll build and test the deployment pipeline accordingly. You'll monitor, optimize, and iterate based on what you already currently have. And finally, you'll be looking into documenting what you have learned and also performing knowledge sharing based on it. So these are all very important key aspects that you'll need to take into account while you look into this process. But this is more or less how it will go for being able to architect these environmentally sound practices, and being able to be mindful on that is a very important thing. Now, let's start off with talking about defining the sustainable deployment goals. Well, we'll really be able to do it in 3 key steps, which is, firstly, we need to perform research. So what is most important to you, and what is most important to your stakeholders? Have your stakeholders been asking on something that has already been recurring? For example, if they've already been asking on how your AWS sustainability is, well, in that case, that's something you can definitely put down as a requirement, or at least research how important it is to be a requirement. And being able to pinpoint the important aspects as part of that will really help you a lot when you go into the next phase, which is abstraction. When you look into abstraction, you'll then look into creating the strategies based on the select KPIs that you've already identified. You need to be able to appropriately use these strategies to be able to then start your deployment process. So being able to center that upon the KPIs that you have identified is a very important thing. Then we go into design, where we then start to design solutions around the KPIs to meet the goals. So no deployments yet. We just want to design the solutions so that we already know an idea of how we're going to implement things, and discuss with the relevant stakeholders and get the necessary input into how these solutions would perform. Would they perform nicely? Would they be able to still meet the goals? What kind of overhead would be requiring? Are there any alternative solutions that can help us achieve this? These are all important considerations when we look into these particular deployments, and being able to think ahead of time of how to be able to handle this will do you a lot of good. Now let's see an example from a Terraform deployment, for example, when we look into starting deployments. So we can see here that some of the choices that we have made are already environmentally considerate. Of course, I don't have a resource called eco-friendly instance, but this is pretty much just to highlight what we really want to get out of it, really. So firstly, we can see that just from making simple deployments, we can make green conscious decisions. For example, we choose the US West region particular, the US West 2 region, just because it has better energy practices. It's greener energy practices, and you can particularly look at this through the AWS documentation as well as to which regions are already using better energy practices. And this can really help both you, your stakeholders, and how you best approach this as well. Aside from that, we can also see that we have made some specific considerations towards the instance type and the lifecycle too. So I'm not asking you to put particularly T3 micro. This is pretty much just to put an example, but basically, depending on what you're currently using it for, always pick the minimum most viable instance, because it does not only save you costs, but you're also able to minimize the carbon footprint that you have by putting in the low impact but scalable instances that you can essentially get the more out from, but as well as ensuring that you're not spending or pretty much overreaching your carbon footprint more than you need. We also are able to then appropriately enable auto scaling as well to adjust the resources based on demand, which is able to reduce waste. So as part of this, we also create a life cycle, and we pretty much set a create before destroy the true too. Moving on to auto scaling, we can start into looking at different aspects of how we could integrate auto scaling as well as part of this too. So for example, we can create an auto scaling group, and as part of this, we can then start to specify a particular max size. Now, again, this is not only to be able to save you costs, but it also helps to be able to limit the carbon footprint that you have to ensure that what you currently have will not exceed your current sustainability goals as well. You need to set current and key goals to your stakeholders, and being able to present this particular data and the KPIs associated with it and the results that you manage to get with it while operating under the KPIs that you've set will really do a lot of good to you. You can also tag these appropriately as well to ensure that these resources are appropriately being scaled according to the auto scaling that we have and keep track of them as well. So for example, if you want to manage this kind of program, you can start out with a subset as well of instances and pretty much track how it performs to another set, which probably is not under this initiative. And that's a great way as well to be able to present the results to relevant stakeholders. We can similarly approach a similar look into CloudWatch as well. So in this case, we are putting in alarms, for example, and putting in alarms such as CPU utilization appropriately with greater than threshold comparisons and CPU utilization monitoring. Accordingly, will also do you a lot of good too in being able to ensure that green practices are being adhered to, ensuring that your utilization does not exceed a particular threshold, which will do you a lot of good, especially if you are setting KPIs related to this too. So this is just a bit of highlight on that. Accordingly, with state management, you'll also be able to do so as well. So you can particularly manage TF states, for example, stored within buckets. So we can, for example, have a bucket called my Terraform state, where we decide to accordingly have the Terraform state stored there. And this can appropriately manage your Terraform state while also ensuring that you are able to adhere within the green practices. And appropriately, we're also declaring the output as well. Now, moving on to Consul as well. Similarly, we can also do something to be able to ensure that our sustainability goals are being adhered to. So, for example, we have established that we will use the data center as AWS US was 2, which pretty much makes sense, as we mentioned before, because we want to make use of the sustainable resources that's currently already evident there. But what we can then also do is that we can also establish a particular raft multiplier. And this will be able to also provide a specific border for how we want our instances to perform as well. So being able to do this, specifying a multiplier that does not exceed what you need, more than you need, will also be able to ensure that the practice that you can do will also be within the green standards. And aside from that, we can also establish a few things, for example, like autopilot. We can appropriately put the redundancy zone tag to zone, put the upgrade version tag to Consul version, and pretty much be able to make key decisions on this one, particularly again highlighting raft multiplier, will be able to do a lot of good. That being said, of course, do not sacrifice performance for sustainability goals as well. Make sure you can meet both, but find the cut in the middle essentially. Then we can move on to creating the pipeline, which if you already played around with AWS for a while, for example, you'll be very familiar with this. So we can briefly just put it at every step of the way by putting in code commit, pushing it up to code build as soon as the code is committed, building it, and appropriately deploying the code as well. And we can have it, for example, in EC2s or Lambdas. And that's pretty much how you'll be able to create a normal pipeline as per the normal practices. Along the way, though, just remember to have sustainability at every step of the way. So think about how you are particularly deploying, for example. Are you already choosing the best instances to deploy? Can you, for example, deploy on a Lambda instead of an EC2? These are all considerations that you need to put into place, and you're able to tailor this accordingly with the tools that you already have, which are Consul and Terraform. When you look into this kind of initiative, you need to also create a timeline appropriately. So you need to think about how we'll be able to appropriately scale towards the future. So for example, we can set 3 key phases. So with phase 1, for example, we can set it by February, and we can say we want to start defining the sustainable goals and KPIs by this particular phase and get it done either by this month or the next month. But then we want to also ensure that we have established when we want to start phase 2. Being able to do this will ensure that your organization commits to key deadlines instead of taking it as a little side trip, essentially. So being able to do that, we'll be able to do a lot of good for that. And within May, for example, we can have phase 2 where we apply the new strategies to the deployments along with the monitoring capabilities. And within phase 3, we'll have committed to being able to gather feedback from monitoring and stakeholders and iterate where necessary too. Now, what are some key tips to be able to define the KPIs? Make sure that they are relevant. That's the most important thing. Do not set vague KPIs or KPIs that are outdated based on historical deployments from like 5 years ago. Make sure that they are in alignment with what your organization believes in, what your resources currently need as part of meeting the performance requirements, and what is feasible to be able to be implemented. So that's very important. And this can be done by consulting stakeholders accordingly. Consult your teams, consult external stakeholders. It's very important to do that. We are also able to then look into defining in terms of cost savings. So as mentioned before, The great thing about sustainable deployments, although it's not always correlated, but it's often correlated with being able to cost save in a process too, because you're also reducing the carbon footprint that you have while being able to reduce the power consumption that you have or CPU utilization that you have, for instance, from EC2 instances, and hence reduce expenses for service that are taken up. You need to consider your target audience. Who will be reading and reviewing KPIs? Make sure that they are at a level that is either low or high enough for the relevant stakeholders to understand. For example, if you want to get buy-in from senior executives within the business, then you need to be able to define them in such a way that they can also understand it. So not too technical, but make sure that it is at a level that they can easily process and understand and be able to communicate clearly, because you need to buy in. You're not pitching to other engineers, for example, in that case. You'll be pitching to them directly because they'll be needing to buy in. So you need to make sure that it is tailored appropriately and make sure it is easy to use. Make sure that it's easy to skim over the KPIs. Make sure it's easy to also find the documentation related to it. And also, make sure it's easy to find and justify key decisions based on what you currently already have. So let's move into talking about a case study now. So this case study is pretty much about an organization that is applied a sustainable initiative over a 6-month period. And what it did is pretty much, this is all about needing the refinement of code and the need to move Graviton instances on AWS. So as you know, this is not an easy process. Oftentimes it means recoding a lot of things, being able to make architecturally sound decisions, which is not always the easiest thing to do, especially when we do such a migration. And of course, there's also the need to satisfy stakeholders with more pressing green issues. So as part of this, HashiCorp was employed to be able to use the Terraform and Consul deployments appropriately using the 6 steps as mentioned. And we want to be able to satisfy stakeholders. So it's a very important thing that we're transparent throughout the whole process and ensure that we have an iterative process in place. So what was the outcome as part of this? We architected the pipelines accordingly. We implemented the necessary green KPIs. And the outcome was that there was a 20% reduction on carbon footprint as part of the initiative. Graviton instances was able to be used successfully. There was a 30% cost reduction. So as mentioned before, they are not always correlated, but when they are, sustainability and cost optimization actually do a lot of good too for the organization. And better running for the services. We found that it was actually much better to be able to run these particular deployments on Graviton, for instances, while also being able to adhere to the green sustainable practices as well. So what do you do to prepare for better sustainable strategies? There's a few things. Run review groups is one. Make sure that you continuously have review groups that are reviewing your strategies and ensure they are adhered to and are in place, and also evaluate how well they're doing. Have training sessions which train people on sustainability and sound practices when deciding what to architect for your organization. These are very key strategies because especially when you onboard new people, people will not be used to the sustainable practice that you have. They might have sustainability practice in an organization that are different from yours, or maybe not sustainable practices at all. Because as engineers, oftentimes people are subjected to prioritizing performance and meeting the requirements first and foremost instead of considering sustainability. And that's why, as an engineer, it's very important to be able to embed that new mindset of sustainability along the process too, because that is going to be a very key factor of how they are able to meet the requirements of your organization. Finally, ensure that you encourage a frame of openness and transparency. So ensure that throughout the whole process, you're open about what is going on within a process, and ensure that you're being transparent about the key decisions that are being made, and ensure that everyone is a part of the decisions too, because you don't want to make decisions from the middle to down, or for example, from the top to down, or, pretty much like just very few people based involved decisions. You need to ensure that a lot of people are involved. Make sure that stakeholders from every possible angle are involved. So what are the key takeaways? Sustainability first always comes with the frame of mind. Ensure that you also understand what your key priorities are. And when you innovate, make sure that you innovate with keeping sustainability in mind, because that is how you'll be able to continue with being able to put sustainability first forward, while also providing innovation for your organization, while also adhering to the green practices. And with Terraform and Consul, HashiCorp's two great tools, along with other deployments that you already currently have, tools based on AWS or Ansible, you'll be able to achieve this without any issues. Well, any issues would be a bit of a stretch, of course, but certainly we'll be able to minimize issues by being able to involve stakeholders appropriately, while also keeping sustainability in mind. Because as we progress towards the future, sustainability will continue to be more and more of a talking point, and being able to be a pioneer within sustainability and moving it forward will certainly do you a lot of good towards the future. So that is all for me. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. And again, feel free to connect with me on any of my socials. I'm happy to take any questions accordingly too. And I look forward to being able to answer some of your questions as well, and hope that you'll be able to also apply some of the practices I've mentioned to your organization and practices as well.